Sunbelt and JMU fans, welcome to the first edition of Word on the Belt. This is a new video series presented by The Breeze, James Madison University's student newspaper. I'm Grant Johnson, one of the sports editors for The Breeze, and tonight I'm joined by Kara Richey, who's a radio voice for Arkansas State athletics for over 10 years. Kara, how are you doing this evening?
Thank you so much for inviting me on to talk about Arkansas State athletics.
Yeah, awesome. I think this is a great opportunity for, JMU fans to kind of, get the gist of the new Sun Belt, a lot of new teams. Arkansas State, we're starting with them. They start with an A. This isn't because they're the first team in the alphabet. It's just how it kind of, came about. So, yeah. So Kara, I'm going to kind of open the floor to you and, talk a little bit about, just the overall history of, Arkansas State athletics. What were some highs? What were some lows? How can, a JMU fan or a Sun Belt fan, any new, ODU people or Marshall people, how can they kind of best kind of get to learn about Arkansas State?
Sure. I'll start with football a little bit because that drives the bus, and that's usually, as college sports fans, what we're mostly into. Arkansas State has a long football history, but it hasn't always necessarily been storied. The very first season for A-State football was 1911. I'm not going to throw a bunch of stories at you about the games against like Corning High School or Camp Pike or whoever else A-State played in the 1910s. But it was kind of a little bit of a slower start in terms of having success. A-State didn't really start to have very many good seasons until the early 1950s. And then things didn't really get going for the program in a big time way until Arkansas State joined the Southland Conference in the mid 60s. And then while they were in that conference, which was about a 23-year span, A-State had some phenomenal success. At that point in time, it was a Division I AA school, which we would think of now as FCS. And they won a small college championship in 1970. They were a runner-up to Georgia Southern of all teams in 86. There were a couple of seasons without a loss. There were 3 seasons where A-State went without a loss. There were 2 11-0 perfect seasons, one of which even led to the creation of the Independence Bowl, which is kind of a roundabout story that maybe we'll touch on some other time. But those 70s and 80s years, early 80s were really good. And then you got into the 90s and Arkansas State decided to join D1A or FBS. And the transition was not a smooth one. Arkansas State didn't initially have a conference home. They went Big West and Independent, and then Big West and Independent, and before eventually landing in the Sun Belt, which they were already affiliated with as a basketball school, but the Sun Belt didn't sponsor football until 2001. Once A-State got there, the 2000s were okay. They started to have a little bit of Division I success, played in the first bowl game as a D1 team, but kind of plateaued a little bit. So the 2010s is when things, really got hopping. The head coach in 2010 was a guy named Steve Roberts, phenomenal evaluator of talent. And he went out and originally hired a guy named Clay Helton to be his head coach, or excuse me, his offensive coordinator. Helton, of course, is now the head coach at Georgia Southern, having previously been at USC. Well, Helton stayed for about a month. So Steve Roberts had to go with his backup plan, who was named Hugh Freeze. So Hugh Freeze was the offensive coordinator for 1 year. After the university decided to part with Steve Roberts, Hugh Freeze stepped into that role in 2011. And that was the very beginning of what most A-State fans kind of refer to as the 5 and 5 years. You had 5 head coaches in 5 seasons. 2010, it was Steve Roberts. 2011, it was Hugh Freeze. Hugh Freeze stayed for 1 year, went to Ole Miss. He's now at Liberty. He was replaced by Gus Malzahn in Jonesboro. Gus Malzahn stayed for 1 year, went to Auburn. Of course, he's now at UCF. He was replaced by Brian Harsin. Once again, Brian Harsin stayed for 1 year. He went back home to Boise State. And then, of course, now he replaced Malzahn yet again, but this time at Auburn. And then the 5th head coach in 5 seasons was Blake Anderson. Blake Anderson ended up staying for 7 years before he eventually moved on to Utah State. And then Arkansas State brought in Butch Jones. Last year was year 1, and that kind of brings us up to present day. When you look at some of the standouts for Arkansas State during that time, some of the big playmakers from those really successful 20 teams are guys like J.D. McKissick, who is right down the road from you guys with the Washington Commanders. He's actually Arkansas State's all-time leader in receptions. Another great player from earlier in that era was Demario Davis. And he is now just a monster linebacker with the New Orleans Saints. He's a captain for the Saints. He just won the NFL's Bart Starr Award. Just a phenomenal player, phenomenal human being. You go back further, there's been a lot of great A-State alums that have made it to the NFL. Bill Bergey was a guy who was huge for the Philadelphia Eagles back in the day. Ray Brown was a phenomenal player. And I'm going to stop there because if I try and go through the list, I'm going to leave out player after player after player. And I don't want to do that. But that's kind of the football history of Arkansas State. When you look around at some other programs, out of the other kind of big four programs, as I'd like to think of it, with football, men's and women's basketball, and baseball, there hasn't been quite that level of success. There's been little pockets of success here and there, but nothing necessarily sustained. Men's basketball hasn't been to the NCAA tournament since '99. Baseball hasn't been since '94. Women's basketball has never been, although they did have some success a few decades back before the tournament was at the field that it's at now, the field size. But other sports, there's some great success right now on the Arkansas State campus. Women's golf, men's golf, both of those programs are on the rise. Soccer as well. Bowling is a powerhouse. They went to 14 straight NCAA tournaments and were actually the runner-up for the national championship in 2021. And track and field, also a powerhouse. They kind of run the Sun Belt Conference right now. The women have won nine straight titles across multiple seasons of cross country and indoor and outdoor track and field, and the men aren't that far behind them. And in terms of historical success, track and field is probably right up there with football as well in terms of cranking out really good alumni, including some Olympic medalists. So that is, I think that's most of kind of the highlights for Arkansas State athletics. I'll throw out one more thing, and I apologize if I'm long-winded because I usually talk for 2 hours a day on my show, but there was a key moment for Arkansas State athletics as a athletic department in 2008. And prior to that time, Arkansas State had the mascot of the Indians. And, the NCAA in the mid 2000s decided that they were going to do away with that. And that if you had, Native American imagery or anything like that, you were going to have to change your mascot or be affiliated with a local tribe or something like that. Or you would be ineligible to host NCAA events, and they would find other ways to penalize you as well. So Arkansas State did not fight that battle. They decided to adopt the mascot of the Red Wolves. 2008 was the first season for that. And the very first game for Arkansas State as the Red Wolves was a win against Texas A&M on the football field at College Station. So started out well. It was a good change all in all.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks so much for that history, Kara. I definitely learned a lot. I mean, like bowling. I mean, who would have thought? I know JMU doesn't really have a bowling program, so definitely interesting there. I guess, kind of coming head to with present times, all this movement in the Sun Belt, new teams, you've got Marshall, you've got Old Dominion, you've got JMU, Southern Mississippi, all this movement, teams departing, UT Arlington, kind of talk about what is it like to, amid all this chaos, amid all this movement, what has it been like to kind of cover Arkansas State this past year?
Sure. Well, I think, if you're in a fan base that is not in the SEC, is not in the Big Ten, is not one of those schools that has like a top 20 budget, there's a little bit of kind of worry about what's going to happen with your institution, because we know that the teams with the most money kind of make the decisions and everybody else has to follow. That being said, it was a situation in the group of five where everybody was kind of waiting to see what the AAC did, because they still have the biggest TV contract. Schools still get the biggest payout. That was still seen as a fairly desirable place, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of fans. So once it became clear, though, that they were going to take teams from Conference USA, then I think there was a lot of just kind of good feelings around the Sun Belt. Like, all right, if this league stays at 10 teams, okay, we'll be okay. Last year, the past few years have been really successful. If this league goes with 12, okay, I think there's some desirable options. We know ultimately the league went with 14, and I think all four are great additions, fitting the geographical footprint, looking and having different programs with incredible levels of success. I think at the end of the day, even though it's always a little bit worrisome when there's change, especially when there's so much else going on in college athletics right now with NIL and the portal and everything else. But at the end of the day, a little bit of worry, but ultimately I think everybody's in a really good spot.
And then kind of, getting past that chaos, now these teams have, an athletic year to play. And, with 2022 coming up, football season right around the corner, basketball out after that. And you talked about the track program, doing stuff indoor, outdoor coming up as well. I mean, maybe what's kind of the outlook for A-State in, with some of these seasons coming up? Like, how's the football team looking, basketball, and then talk about some of the successful programs as well that you mentioned earlier.
Sure. With football, I think the words I've kind of thrown around already is cautious optimism. Last year was not good. Arkansas State won 2 games last year. Only one of those was over an an FBS opponent. They finished dead last in the Sun Belt Conference. None of those are acceptable for Arkansas State. None of those are acceptable for the A-State fans. So there has to be improvement in year 2 for Butch Jones. That being said, he brought in the Sun Belt's best recruiting class, both by looking at the way high school players are evaluated, and then the overall recruiting class when you factor in transfers as well. You got some talent coming back, no doubt about it. And I think most importantly, the defense is going to have an overhaul. The defense was bad last year. I think it was worst in the nation in rush yards allowed. It was really close to the bottom in points per game allowed. I think maybe 4th from the bottom. They're just all bad metrics. Like, nobody wants to think about those numbers last year because they weren't any good. So in a sense, there's a little bit of a feeling, especially defensively, kind of a nowhere to go but up vibe in terms of football. And I do expect improvement. I really do. I don't think I'm being a complete homer. I just think this team is going to be better than it was last season in a lot of different aspects. And when you look at some of the other fall sports, of course, you've got soccer, which has been really good in the Sun Belt. In fact, they've won a couple regular season titles, but they've came up just short in the league tournament and getting that NCAA tournament bid. There are high expectations there for that program. Volleyball has a new head coach, and he's actually a guy by the name of Brian Gerwig. He's been at Arkansas State as an assistant before, so there are high expectations for him. You just don't really know how to get a guesstimate on what expectations will be in year 1. Once you kind of get to, the winter sports, your guess might be as good as mine on men's and women's basketball. And that's just because there's been a lot of roster turnover. With men's basketball and women, of course, with the portal, there have been a lot of different subtractions and a lot of new faces to get to know as well. Men's basketball, I'm already fascinated by the makeup of the team. In the offseason, unfortunately, A-State did lose the best player that I've seen in an A-State uniform as an adult, and that was Noor Shadomir, just an absolute phenomenal talent. A guy from Nicaragua, first player from his country to earn a Division I scholarship playing basketball, and just so good at so many different things. Well, he's at Miami now, so you got to replace him, and it's kind of a situation where you're not going to be able to bring in just a dude to replace his level of talent and production. But Arkansas State has gone out and gotten several really good pieces that I'm fascinated by. And kind of what several of these guys are is that they're the tall, rangy shooters. I mean, I think Aladdin Boutayeb is like 7'2", but he could step back and shoot a little bit. And there's some other players that fill that role as well. So there's about 6 new faces on the men's basketball squad. And that's the same thing with the women as well. There were several players that left. With women's basketball last year in December, actually, right before the start of Sun Belt Conference play, the head coach decided to step down. And so Destiny Rogers became the interim head coach. A-State, the administration was pleased with what she did. So she officially took over that role in March, but you had some players leave. She brought in a couple of players as well. However, A-State had some phenomenal freshmen last year, and none of those hit the portal. So they're all coming back. A-State got down to a 7-player roster for a couple of games. So those players as freshmen played a ton of minutes. So they're going to come back and they're going to be ready to go once we get to the spring. Indoor track and field, cross country, those sports are going to crush it because they've been good for forever. Same thing with bowling as well. There are high expectations around all of those programs. Tennis, of course, is a split sport, or excuse me, tennis is in the spring, but don't know what to expect there. That program currently does not have a head coach. So it's kind of hard to get a vibe on what expectations are when you don't know who's going to be leading. In the spring, baseball will have to be better. It's going to have to be a lot better. It was a very bad season there. So that is, there's some question marks there, but I think, everybody is hoping that football gets off to a much better start than it did in 2022 and kind of sets a more positive tone for the rest of the academic and athletic year.
I think football is a good segue to kind of flip the page and, get your kind of thoughts on JMU a little bit. Obviously, been a power at the FCS level for, 2 decades now, turning the page to the Sun Belt, move kind of, primarily driven by football, even though most of the programs are going along with it to the Sun Belt. I guess from an outsider perspective, Kara, like talk a little bit about, what kind of you see in JMU and how you think they kind of fit in this new look Sun Belt, kind of across the board.
Sure. Well, one of the things that I find interesting is the Sun Belts, from everything I've read, they've kind of reached out maybe a little bit to JMU in the past because the Sun Belt has gone through a couple different waves of realignment. In 2012, there were a lot of programs that left the league and went and joined Conference USA. So that was when, or excuse me, that was when the Sun Belt went out and added Georgia Southern and App State and Georgia State and just kind of had a reshaping of the league. Western Kentucky left in 2013. Shortly after that, a few years down the road after that, Coastal Carolina came in. And I think the whole time maybe the Sun Belt was hoping that maybe JMU would be ready to make that leap, but obviously they wanted to stay and on their end take care of everything behind the scenes and make sure they were ready to take that jump when the time came. As far as my knowledge of James Madison, I'm so fascinated by what their football season is going to look like because as a Sun Belt fan, you don't have to go back very far to see a team that came from the FCS level and had immediate Sun Belt success. Georgia Southern's first year in the conference, they went 8-0. That very same year was App State's first year in the conference, and they didn't go 8-0, but they got to bowl eligibility. Now they couldn't go because of some goofy NCAA rules, but both of those teams came in and had success in year one. I don't quite see that happening for James Madison, at least not at the level that Georgia Southern did. And that's not a knock on JMU. I feel like this conference is a lot better right now than it was a decade ago. So I think it would be just significantly harder for anybody to run the table at this point in time. So I think they can come in and have success. I just don't know where, as I learn more about JMU, I'm just not sure what level of success that's going to end up being, where they're going to fall on that spectrum. I did also, of course, like so many other people around the country, kind of get on that JMU bandwagon for softball a couple of years ago and follow along with everything that Odyssey Alexander was doing and that huge upset and everything. So that is, since then, I've looked a little bit more at some other JMU programs, but I think for most fans that are looking at JMU, they know about the phenomenal FCS success. And they know about a little bit about softball. And I think both of those will make them good fits at the Sun Belt.
Yeah, no, for sure, understand that, and yeah, I mean the trepidation with football. I think there's some of that in JMU Nation as well. There's a quarterback turnover. One of the top defensive players transferred to Texas, last month. So yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how JMU kind of fits in that first year. And like you said, Sun Belt a lot more competitive than I think it was. When App State was coming over as well as Georgia Southern. Two former CAA rivals to JMU as well. So awesome. So, Kara, one other thing I want to hit on. So, JMU plays Arkansas State October 15th in football. Let's say a JMU fan is, making that trip out there. Let's say a media member is making their trip out there. Where are some places in Jonesboro that a JMU fan can get a good bite to eat? Where are some places in town that you kind of recommend to kind of get the whole A-State Jonesboro experience?
Sure. There are, there's a couple of different places now that are close to the stadium that are great spots. J-Town's Grill is right across from the stadium. It's decked out in all the A-State gear. They blow the train whistle every time Arkansas State scores a touchdown. That's going to be, I guess, let me back up. If I'm scripting like a perfect day for somebody coming in from out of town, I would probably start with breakfast at a place called the Parsonage. It's in downtown Jonesboro. I would do lunch at J-Town's Grill, which is right across from the stadium. And then, if it's a 6 o'clock game, maybe just take a quick lap around Tailgate City and see what's going on early. Pre-game drinks, assuming everybody is 21. I know I'm talking to some college students here. Pre-game drinks at Native Brewery, which actually just opened in Jonesboro about a year ago, but it's all local brews and tacos and things like that. They're phenomenal. Then, of course, you go to the game. The best place to people watch immediately after that is actually the Embassy Suites, which is the hotel is right next door to the stadium. It's across the parking lot. So that's the place that's going to be the best place for fans to stay. And then it's also where a lot of people come immediately after the game to either celebrate or drown their sorrows. The post-game party would then shift to the social, which is also close to the stadium. And then if you, again, are of age, you would go do last call at Cregan's and Brick House downtown. So there's a lot of different great locally owned options in Jonesboro. And also, say you're rolling in on Friday, I left out the dinner establishments, the 501 or Omar's Uptown or Skinny J's. There's just a lot of great places. If anybody's coming in, don't hesitate to send me a DM or something like that, and I can pretty much give you a rundown of the menu. I think of every place I just listed.
Awesome. Yeah. And I mean, I appreciate the rundown for sure. So, yeah, Kara, that's pretty much all I have for you. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of, plug what you're doing, your radio work at Arkansas State. So if you're going to go ahead and, kind of say when you're on air.
Sure. Well, I'm on air from noon to 2 Monday through Friday, Central Time. And my show, we touch on a little bit of some of the area pro teams and the Memphis Grizzlies and the St. Louis Cardinals, but we heavily cover Arkansas State athletics. My station is affiliated with Arkansas State Athletics. And in our radio group, we are actually the flagship home of A-State football on 107.9 K-Fine. On game days, in addition to the daily show, on game days, I host a show called Wolf Howls, and that is the post-game call-in show. So whether it's good, bad, or ugly, I get to hear from the fans afterwards, and it is certainly never, ever, ever a dull moment on that. But for anybody who wants to listen to the daily show, especially once it gets closer to A-State and JMU, 953theticket.com is the place to stream us, and also the website for our interview archive. And I'm on Twitter at Kara_Richey, and I'm spend a little bit too much time on Twitter. So if you shoot me a message, there's no doubt I'll get back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Kara. Yeah, no, game week, I'll definitely be tuned in and try to get, as many tidbits as I can for the JMU A-State matchup. So yeah, Kara, like I said, all I have for you this evening, thank you so much time for coming in on the first episode of Word on the Belt. We'll have more Word on the Belt content through July. Some episodes will be hosted by my co-sports editor, Madison Hritzik, as well as the Breeze senior anchor for Breeze TV, Joshua Dixon. But for this episode, that's all we have. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.